Pawel Zerka, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
Thanks for the invitation.
Let me start with the first question. In one of your commentary, you discussed the possibility of a far-right surge in the upcoming European Parliament elections. Given the current political climate and recent events in Europe, how likely do you think a far-right victory is, and what would be its implications for the future of EU?
Yeah, so listen, we never suggested that there will be a far-right victory. Let me just start by saying that I'm coming from a foreign policy think tank. So we are not people studying populism the way you do it. We are interested in a foreign policy context. And European elections are important for us because we believe that they will have an impact on Europe's foreign policy in the years to come. That's why we are doing public opinion polling regularly to see how the public sentiment in Europe is evolving. And that's why we also, on the occasion of those elections, we asked our friends, academics led by Simon Hicks, to do a prognosis of how the next European Parliament could look like. They did it in January, so still a couple of months ago and ahead of the real campaign. And their prognosis has shown that the next European Parliament is likely moving to the right, which means that the two more Eurosceptic groupings, the Identity and Democracy, where we can find the German AfD or Marine Le Pen, and the other group called ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists, where we can find Jarosław Kaczynski or Giorgia Meloni's party or the Spanish Vox. We expected both of those groups to increase their number of seats. Still, altogether, that means that the parties that we consider as anti-European, which perhaps is a strong word, and it is a good description of some of those parties, but many are simply Eurosceptic rather than anti-European. But we expect that this entire block of anti-Europeans, both on the right and on the far left, to go from the current 30% up to 37%. So they would still be a minority and not even close to a majority. In that sense, we never expect them to win the election, but it will still be largely a success for those Eurosceptic parties if on the next consecutive election they manage to further increase their number of seats and their power in the European Parliament. And it is all the more important because at the same time the context in national capitals is changing very quickly. So just a couple of days ago, we heard about the new coalition government in the Netherlands being formed, where the largest member of the coalition is the Freedom Party of Geert Wilders. We also see the far-right parties being part of governments in countries like Finland or Croatia. We see that in Austria, the polls are showing that the Freedom Party is leading and ahead of this year's national elections in Austria. This is quite worrisome. We, of course, have Giorgia Meloni, who leads the coalition government in Italy, and even if she has managed to largely detoxify her image and she is no longer seen as such a problem by most of the other European leaders or the public itself. Still, she represents Brothers of Italy, and this party continues having several disturbing elements in their political platform. What I'm trying to say is that it's hard to define what victory for the far right or for the Eurosceptics actually means. They are not going to win the European elections in the sense of gaining the majority of seats, but the fact that they improved their number of seats is already a victory, and this victory is particularly important when their position in several national capitals across Europe is also getting strengthened.
All right. But even if we see a surge in the right-wing, far-right parties in European elections, what will happen to the liberal democracy as we know it?
Yeah, I think that this largely depends also on what the other part of the political spectrum, which we tend to consider pro-European, will do. In a way, it's the center-right parties or liberal parties who, by working with the far right, legitimize and normalize the far right alternative. I don't know whether there's it's a long discussion. Should there be a sanitary cordon around the parties which whose political platform also brings some illiberal and undemocratic elements, or but then if the critics of sanitary cordons say that first of all that only makes the far right strength stronger, plus it's real people who have voted for them, and they voted for them in democratic elections, so that the will of the people should be respected. I think that was the main argument why the mainstream pro-European parties in the Netherlands have chosen to create a coalition with Geert Wilders. Simply, they realized that he leads the party that won the largest number of votes in the country. So the choice of the electorate needs to be respected. But then, when you start ruling with the and entering coalitions with the far right or radical right parties, then you also first of all give them more impact on the policies, and that can be most visible when it comes to migration or climate policies. Plus, you also normalize a certain language that they tend to use, and a certain approach to democracy that they have, where they distrust the elites, where they glorify a sort of a direct voice of the people, where they tend to simplify the politics, whereas problems with which politics is dealing are very often quite complex. And when you normalize them, then it makes even more difficult to fight with the problems that they can bring. I don't know whether it means a crisis for the liberal democracy. I think that the reason why my feeling is that we often start the discussion about the far right or radical right from a wrong place. We are demonizing them, presenting them as an alien body and as a problem, whereas perhaps they are simply a response to a different problem. So if I believe that many people choose to vote for Giorgia Meloni in Italy, or AfD in Germany, or Vox in Spain and Chega in Portugal, because they have been disappointed with what we call the pro-European mainstream, and disappointed for several reasons. Either because the mainstream parties have proven to be corrupt, which was largely the case in Spain, where the two mainstream parties were struggling with corruption scandals over the past decade. Or people might be disappointed because the center left and center right became increasingly similar to each other. So on the occasion of the as if there was no alternative, they started representing something which was then mocked as a Tina politics of there is no alternative. So whether you are on the center left or center right, you accept presence of the state in the economy because COVID has shown that pouring the money into the economy is necessary. You also accept the necessity to focus on climate change policies because everyone accepts that this is a major challenge. And I think that this previous division between the left and right has become so blurred that simply instead of the left and right, we started having a center, and it's kind of natural that people are looking for some sort of an alternative. If there was no longer an alternative to choose from between left and right, then the alternative that became most important in many countries is between the center and the alternative, which and that alternative is can be presented as radical. It is often positioned on the far right, but for many people who are willing to vote for those parties, they see it as the only credible alternative for what they consider as an increasingly similar center. So I think that we tend to demonize the far right parties, but in a way they use the opportunity and provide a response to a certain problem that exists in the center of our political spectrum.
All right. ECFR's research back in March argued that the agenda of European Union will not be defined by far-right parties as they are divided on their aims and ambitions. Do you still have the same diagnosis?
These are my colleagues who authored the paper. I will serve as an imperfect spokesperson and simply explain why, in what sense I believe they are correct. So, and in what sense they are surely not. So, currently, the public debate ahead of the European elections is largely dictated by the far right parties indirectly. So every day, myself and my colleagues receive plenty of calls and questions from journalists, and 95% of those questions are about the threat of the far right. It feels like this was the only topic ahead of the European elections. As if there was no positive story that could be told about those elections and a positive agenda that the pro-European parties could have on their standards. It feels as if the main topic was the danger of the far right, and this in itself shows that the far right is having an impact on the debate. And they have also been the ones who had a key impact on on why migration was debated and how it was debated, prompting many even more centrist leaders like Emmanuel Macron in France to move to a harsher line on migration, because he knew that he could not afford to be seen to be too liberal on that point. Even in Poland, where we have a new pro-European government led by Donald Tusk with strong European credentials, he is also quite conservative when he talks about migration, because he's kind of auto-censoring himself in order not to expose himself to an easy criticism from the law and justice, so a more anti-European alternative in the country. So I think so I feel that yes, the radical right or far right parties have already had an impact on how topics are discussed in Europe. Also, climate has become a topic where they benefit from people's disappointment or dissatisfaction with how that policy has been dealt with on the European level. And this makes it more difficult for the otherwise pro-European centrist forces to stand up and defend Europe's climate policies. So I agree, they have an impact on the debate. Where I believe my colleagues were suggesting that their impact will be limited, this concerned policies, because in order to change policies or to implement new policies, you need a stable cooperation and a majority, and whereas parties, even if they are grouped in just two families in the European Parliament, this ECR and IND, they in the past used to disagree with each other on plenty of occasions. So those groups are much less coherent, consistent than those located more in the center of the political spectrum. Still, I don't exclude the possibility that if they increase their number of seats and their position in the parliament, and currently each of those two groups can hope to become the third largest political group in the parliament, ahead of liberals, not to mention the Greens. Or if they in some miraculous way manage to merge, then they could even become the second largest family in the European Parliament. In any case, once they are stronger, they could also become more united, I think, because they could do it for pragmatic reasons. And we see, looking at Meloni and Geert Wilders, how they behave domestically, that leaders of Europe's far right have started acting very pragmatically, and that they are ready to give up on some elements of their political platform that seemed important, just to preserve the small parts of their political platform which are really important for them, and just to be at the government. Sorry, I'm talking about it in vague terms, but more practically, one of the conclusions that I have from looking at the Dutch negotiations of the new coalitions is that Geert Wilders has agreed not to become a prime minister. Then he has agreed not to question the general support of the Netherlands for Ukraine, and what he got in return, on top of being part of government, is preserving the strong position on migration policy, as well as some leeway to seek exemptions for the Netherlands in the climate policy. So it looks like it's migration and climate that were really critical for him, but he was ready to give up on foreign policy. And a similar thing we could say about Giorgia Meloni, whom many people feared, but who then has shown to be quite constructive on several points, so that the rest of Europe is happy, and so that she can, and this leaves her room to do domestically some stuff which perhaps is invisible for most of Europeans, but which could still be worrisome. And so I was saying that those forces can still have an impact, but they are divided. What I should add to this is that I think that the result of the European elections, in terms of the distribution of seats, can still have an important impact on European policies, but not just because the far right or anti-Europeans are gaining in seats, but mostly because EPP, the center right, we cannot fully trust them on what they will choose. They seem to be quite divided and at a crossroads. And the main reason why, for example, climate policy, some of them could be revised in a negative way from my point of view, or the main reason why we could see harsher approach to migration or to enlargement, is because the EPP parliamentarians on those topics could choose to vote rather with the far right than with liberals and the social democrats. In a way, if your question is there a danger for liberal democracy, maybe that would be an exaggeration for me, but there is surely a danger for what the EU will be standing for in the years in the next years from now. But that danger is, the responsibility for that danger lays on the shoulders of not just the far right, but even more so of the center right.
All right. In your article published at Euronews back in March, you argue that far-right parties have been successful in detoxifying themselves, and consequently, it has been more difficult for mainstream parties to make a convincing case to save Europe from far-right parties. Can you please elaborate on how successful detoxifying has been?
So we have asked, so I'm the one who is daily looking and doing the public opinion polls on foreign affairs. And one of the questions that we tested in our latest poll was to see how the different leaders of the far right or anti-European parties in every country. So it was adjusted to every country. In Italy, we asked about Giorgia Meloni. In Poland, we asked about Jarosław Kaczyński, leaders of AfD in Germany, or of the Freedom Party in Austria. So, and in each country, we ask people, do you consider that this person, Jarosław Kaczyński or Marine Le Pen, wants to, first, get your country out of the EU, secondly, get your country of the Eurozone, and thirdly, obstruct the work of the European Union. And then we looked at the results, and we divided voters into those who are supporters of a given leader, of Meloni, Kaczynski, or Le Pen, and all the rest. And there were some cases, like Poland, where very few voters of Jarosław Kaczyński believed that he has some anti-European intentions, whereas 2/3 of all the rest believed that he really is a danger for Poland's presence in the EU, that he wants to bring Poland out of the European Union and obstruct the work of the EU. But there were countries like Italy, actually principally Italy is the country where we could see that Giorgia Meloni has managed wonderfully to detoxify her image, because it's not just her voters who don't believe she has any dangerous intentions vis-a-vis Europe. It's also all the rest who don't believe that she could seek to get Italy out of the Eurozone, of the EU, or to obstruct the works of the European Union. And I think that shows that she has really managed to create an image of somebody who is a constructive and reliable leader, despite of all the fears that many could have ahead of her taking over as the country's prime minister. And I very much feel that Geert Wilders is learning from her. That's why he's also not so radical. He was not so radical in those negotiations for the new government in the Netherlands, but rather adopted a conciliatory pose, just to be there in the government and to preserve the core elements of his platform. I also believe that while Giorgia Meloni in the past was learning from Marine Le Pen, this time it's the other way around. It's Marine Le Pen who, ahead of the 2027 elections, is learning from Giorgia Meloni. And in a way, looking from the distance at this phenomenon, there are reasons to be happy about it. It shows that that once that those anti-European or Eurosceptic forces behave differently depending on whether they are in eternal opposition or whether they actually are offered the steers of the country. It's promising that once they get to government, they start behaving more responsibly. Although let's note that this is not always the case, that Poland or Hungary or the US with Donald Trump are clear demonstrations that there can be scary leaders who, when getting to government, continue being scary and continue having negative impacts on national politics and on the democracy in the country. So I think it's dangerous that the example of Giorgia Meloni could kind of normalize the far right threat, and therefore makes, for example, many people in France say, look, in Italy they feared Giorgia Meloni and nothing bad happened. So perhaps also in our country, in France, we shouldn't be that worried by Marine Le Pen, and we shouldn't listen to all of those pro-European radicals who are so afraid of that far-right threat. Whereas perhaps in France, it would be a completely different story than in Italy. Not just because France is a different country, member of the Security Council, country holding a nuclear power, and a much bigger economy, therefore having a more systemic impact on the European economy, but also because Marine Le Pen could choose to behave differently than Giorgia Meloni and be more radical, especially in the context where the democratic system in France, with a presidential system, would give her much more power, and she would be much less constrained by the democratic system, plus also less constrained by the economic factors, because perhaps the reason to explain Giorgia Meloni's constructiveness is a little bit the fact that Italian economy needed stability, and Giorgia Meloni understood that her survival as prime minister depends on whether she can also get the trust of the markets and not just of the other leaders. But I think that Marine Le Pen will be less concerned about those issues.
All right. Lastly, Pawel, your article mentions the potential for a bittersweet victory for progressives. Could you elaborate on what this might look like in practice and what it would mean for the EU's internal dynamics and policies? And how concerned are you about the mainstream parties to ape far right to garner more votes? In other words, are you concerned that the values of far right parties will be mainstreamed by the center right parties?
Exactly. We already mentioned this, that the danger is not so much in the or not only in the far right, but in the center right, aping the far right, which they have already largely done on migration, which they are increasingly doing on climate, and which I think that they might be continue doing, because that's the approach that they seem to privilege, like hoping that they can still keep their voters from going away more to farther right by moving farther right themselves. So a bittersweet victory. Um, Actually, thinking about the European elections, we have still 3 weeks to go. I am starting to be more concerned by a low turnout than by the result. As I said at the beginning, I don't expect, and I think we should not expect a result to be a complete catastrophe, because even if the far right increases the number of seats, it will be just some increase in the number of seats, but still them being a clear minority. I think what is much more concerning for me is that I see no reasons why the turnout should be high. Uh, I'm currently visiting several EU member states and following the discussion in those that I know a little bit better. So I follow closely the developments in Poland and France. But recently I've been to Italy. Just yesterday I came from Greece. And these are all different cases. But in many places, I see that there is no debate, no campaign, and no clear stakes for the voters as to why they should actually bother to vote. And even for me as an expert, it's sometimes difficult to find really convincing arguments for why people who should bother to vote in a country like Greece, which sends 21 members to the European Parliament out of 720. Uh, it wouldn't make any difference for Europe whether the governing party, New Democracy, gets 9 rather than 7 MEPs. Um, it's very difficult to make a case and to explain to people why it's important for them to spend a part of a sunny weekend going to the polling station. I also see that in Poland, um, even the ruling pro-European coalition is not investing a lot of capital into this campaign. Perhaps they realized that if they did, then they would mobilize not only their own voters but also the voters of Law and Justice. Whereas they perhaps realized that after several different elections in the country. So we had the parliamentary elections in the autumn, then local elections a month ago. People are already tired with elections. You cannot expect them to vote again, especially when perhaps people believe that they have done their job, but by letting the pro-European forces regain power in the autumn. And and yes, and why should they now be caring to vote in European elections? When I hear Donald Tusk, Poland's prime minister, sometimes saying that these are critical elections for the country, even myself, I don't find it credible, because they are. It's very difficult to explain why actually are they so critical. Uh, and I feel that 5 years ago there were some reasons that helped to mobilize voters. Perhaps climates for the Fridays for the Future and the climate urgency partly helped. perhaps also the freshness of the argument about the danger of the far right getting many seats helped mobilize the pro-European basis. But you cannot repeat the same argument again. And climate is no longer such a motivating tool because throughout those 5 years, European Union has introduced a lot of very progressive climate legislation. And while I myself find it a good thing, I perfectly understand that the European society is divided and largely critical. It is also critical of how the EU has managed the COVID pandemic or how the war in Ukraine has been dealt with by the European Union. Some of the people are critical because they would like Europe to be even more supportive of Ukraine. But most of those who are critical are simply feeling that European Union is too much pushing Ukraine towards the fight rather than investing in some peace solutions. And therefore, what we see in our polls is a lot of dissatisfaction with the EU, and I think that the difficulty is to accept that and to say, okay, we can that EU should have this quality of self-correction, and if you are critical of some of the things that the EU is doing, that shouldn't mean that you are anti-European. I think that we are at the moment when it's the pro-European forces that should create that room for citizens to convey their dissatisfaction, but seek solutions together to correct the EU, because plenty of people are kind of pro-European, but at the same time critical of many things that the European Union is doing. So the task for the next 5 years is to somehow process that criticism of EU, but it can, so that it's a constructive criticism rather than a destructive one. But a short-term challenge is that uneasiness, dissatisfaction, coupled with not very clear stakes of that election, to my mind, will translate into a rather low participation rate. And that participation rate in itself might become a problem because it will give a much weaker legitimacy to the next European leaders than what we have seen 5 years ago.
All right. Pawel Zerka, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate that.
Thanks a lot and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. All the best.